Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to welcome your MC for the 2020 Distinguished Business Leader Summit. Deborah Yedlin is Chancellor of the University of Calgary.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Deborah Yedlin. As we broadcast from Calgary, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And please join us by acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples in your location. For months, we have faced unprecedented crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on our economy, our healthcare system, and our collective wellness. Crises, the unpredictable, wide-ranging, and externally driven events that shake us to our core, present unique challenges for the ethical leader. Facing uncertainty, quickly changing circumstances, and competing demands, all of this at a time of very high emotional levels, ethical business leaders face a daunting test. Today, we explore this pressing theme of ethical leadership in a crisis. Since 1993, the Distinguished Business Leader Award has celebrated ethical leaders in Calgary with a gala dinner. The annual partnership between the Haskayne School of Business, the Calgary Chamber, and the Calgary Foundation supports the full spectrum of ethical leadership. There are scholarships for students, emerging entrepreneur scholarships for those starting out in business, and a Distinguished Business Leader Award for a lifetime of achievement in ethical leadership. We've postponed our gala until 2021, but the need to support our students has not changed, and neither has the need to celebrate ethical leaders. The Calgary business community has always been known for its can-do attitude and entrepreneurial spirit, and through our DBLA program and award, we have celebrated meaningful leadership that builds our communities. This year, we can't gather in person, but we are thrilled to announce we have received a significant gift from a community leader in Calgary who is kickstarting our scholarship fundraising with a tremendously generous gift of $100,000 to our DBLA endowment. Thank you so much. 100% of the money raised from today's online event will support the scholarships, and we thank each and every one of you who have given to support the next generation of leaders. Today's DBL Summit program will be an hour long and explore the theme of ethical leadership in crisis. We'll look at ethical leadership during crisis, in recovery, and in the transformation that happens afterwards. We'll hear from 9 speakers taking part in 3 panels, and we encourage you to get involved and ask questions at every panel. Let's begin at looking at ethical leadership during a crisis.
Please welcome Jim DeWald, Dean of the Haskayne School of Business.
Welcome to the 2020 Distinguished Business Leaders Summit. On behalf of the 3 presenting partners, the Haskayne School of Business, the Calgary Chamber, and Calgary Foundation, we thank you for joining us. Let's jump right in. Crises come in many forms, but in today's discussion, we are looking at externally driven, generally unpredictable crises with widespread impact. We're living through one right now with COVID-19. In Alberta, we have overcome others such as floods, fires, and tornadoes. Ethical leaders know that to act ethically is not something you switch on and off. It is learned and honed through years of practice long before a crisis has hit. During crisis, the signposts of ethically run organizations are unmistakable. They are the organizations that not only survive, but excel and thrive in crisis times. I see it in multinationals who transformed to manufacture, supply, and distribute masks, ventilators, disinfectants, and use their expertise. When crises hit, they can expose leaders. For some, a crisis exposes incompetence and self-interest. But crisis can also reveal courage, resilience, and deep concern for others. These are the leadership traits we need in our society. We need the leaders who will do what's right for the organization, but also recognize and accept the role they play in improving society. A deep concern for others is the hallmark of ethical leadership. To tackle the questions of ethical leadership in crisis, we've pulled together a distinguished panel of leaders. George Brookman is a successful entrepreneur and quintessential Calgary business and community leader. Often referred to as Mr. Calgary, George is the 2008 recipient of the Distinguished Business Leader Award. Marcos Lopez is CEO of ShareWorks, Alberta's own unicorn. He has led from startup to billion-dollar purchase by Morgan Stanley. And Professor Joanne Ciulla is among the world's foremost experts on ethical leadership, heading the Institute for Ethical Leadership at Rutgers University. My question to the panel is, how would you describe ethical leadership in a crisis, and how is it different than during normal times?
Thanks, Jim. And I'm going to direct that question to Joanne. Joanne, if you could address Jim's question.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and it's a real pleasure to be here with this important event. Let's start first with what ethical leadership is. Well, first of all, it's a very simple idea in some respects, though much harder to practice than it is to describe. Ethical leadership is a leader who is both ethical and competent. And what I mean by that is that competency, the ability to get the job done, to do the job that a leader is there for, also requires that they do it in the ethically right way for the right ethical reasons. And these things really shape what makes a good leader or a bad leader. We know there's some leaders who are very competent but not very ethical. And then there's other leaders who are very ethical but not very competent. Of course, the trick is to understand how those two things intertwine. Now we turn to a crisis like today, and during a crisis, things become somewhat different for leaders. It's when we really need them, and we need them on several levels. The first level that I'd like to emphasize is the level of care. When there's a crisis, people immediately look to the leaders. What do they think? What are they saying? And most important, which might sound odd, where are they? So you're all familiar with the expression we use for bad leaders in times of crisis: Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Now, what's interesting about that, if you go back to the story in ancient history, is, there's a huge fire in Rome and Nero is at his vacation house. He comes to Rome, and as the story goes, he goes to his palace and he makes up a song about the fire. It's not exactly what we want from leaders, but think about what that story means in terms of the notion of care. Leaders, first of all, have to show up and be public. People need to see them. And doesn't mean they need to see them doing something useless. They need to see them. They need to get clear information from them. They need to be both encouraged and empowered by them. And part of this is sending out a clear message. And more importantly, they want to know that leaders are paying attention. And this is something that takes place in many different ways. A lot of times in crises, leaders are in the wrong place at the wrong time. But here, as you've noticed, I'm sure with Canadian leaders who have done well during this crisis, and certainly with American leaders who have done well, their presence is both calming, it's informative, it's unambiguous, and it helps people to feel like there's some stability in a time when things are really unstable. So I think in a crisis, there are these kinds of substantive but emotional things that really make leadership an interesting challenge. And one would hope, as some of the people said in the wonderful comments in the introduction to this, that leaders can take this, empower their people, and then use this time to make their businesses and their people better. So thank you for that great question.
Thank you for your answer. And I think one theme that we keep hearing is the need to communicate and to be transparent. I'd like to direct the next question to George. What are the key lessons that all business leaders should take away from this crisis?
Thanks. Thank you, Deborah. I always really like the quotation by John Rockefeller many years ago when he said, when everybody starts to say it's unbelievable, then it is unbelievable. And we were going through a period of time in our city, not the first time we've done that, where we thought the the price of oil would go up, the office space would go always in demand, et cetera, and there'd be a pandemic never crossed any of our minds. The reality is that every day in business, you have to be prepared for the unpredictable, for the black swan. Things change. There are no straight lines, whether it's straight lines of revenue, straight lines of health, straight lines of reliability. And so it's very important that business leaders, I love Joanne's comment, communication. It's very important that business leaders are always communicating, not just with their employees, but with their customers, with the public at large, to get a sense of what might be happening in the community. And I think that we get into moments in our business where we're so confident in the future, and we have to stay confident in the future, but we get so confident in the future that we can't even foresee that things will change, and things always change. I've lived through 4 recessions in this community, as some of you others have, and we have to move forward with confidence, we have to move forward with optimism, but we have to also be realistic. And I think that's the key to the future if we're going to be successful, not only getting out of this, but keeping our province and our city and our country moving forward in a strong direction as we go forward.
I'd like to remind, thanks George, I'd like to remind everyone who's joining us today that we'd like to see your questions as well. So please share them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And while we're waiting for more questions to come through, I'm going to ask Marcos just what his thoughts are on how companies stay focused on the long-term visions for their success, but also on the short-term struggles. Is it even possible? I mean, there's quite a challenging balance that companies and leaders have to strike.
Yeah, I think for sure. We've certainly seen through this pandemic, the horizon the staff have gets really, really short as you look at these horrific layoff numbers and what's happening to the economy and their immediate families and their health. Meanwhile, the business needs to continue moving on, and you need to kind of keep that long-term trajectory. I think, to me, what's enabled our group, and it's been a good test for us, is the value set we put in place early and rewarded and hired and promoted for really let the organization transform and go into this pandemic and have a good, thoughtful year for the different situations everybody's in as they shift from go to the office every day to work from home while the velocity of the business continues on. It's been neat to see that transition and that value set continue, and folks have a bit of empathy and bring that honesty of like, hey, I got a 2-year-old at home and she's crying right now and I can't be in this meeting, and is that okay? And so, you know, I think one of the things we've tried to encourage folks is you've taken work home, but that's still home for your family and your kids. Don't try and make home work because this is a stressful time for everybody, and just get rid of the bravado. It's hard for everybody, and I think leaders should show that, and it lets folks then have a longer term vision and also recognize that it's hard right now.
So how do you this is a question to all the panelists, how do you identify and cultivate leaders that emerge during these extraordinary times? What's the role of business? What's the role of academic institutions? What's the role of the community? How do those pieces work together to cultivate the next generation of leaders?
Dave, I'd just like to make a comment on that. Visibility is so important, whether it's the university president or the CEO of a company or a community leader. Being visible and not hiding, and I love the empathy word that Marco said. We have to have empathy. There are people out there who are very much afraid right now. They're afraid for their health, their jobs, their families, and it's up to the business leaders to have that empathy and be seen as understanding what people are going through. I think that's very important.
Before I ask the other panelists to respond, I just want to point everybody to the screen. You'll see a poll question, and I'd like everybody to answer that question and let us know what you think. And now that you've seen the question on the screen, I'm going to ask Joanne to weigh in on the question that was posed about how we cultivate leaders during these extraordinary times.
Well, you know, I mean, the irony of it is, and I'm not quite going to answer your question, but the irony is very often leaders emerge in this period of time. And I think that's what's interesting about leadership is it can be quite fluid, that sometimes people are the people of the moment, and they come on the stage of history and have exactly what's needed. At some other time, leadership is contextual. At some other time, they may not work. So I don't think this is the time we cultivate for them, but we actually can identify them, and we identify them by what they do and their sense of what needs to be done.
That comment has been made by many former politicians and former leaders. They were the leaders at the time and may not have succeeded in other times. Marcos, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with Joanne. I think, there's different leadership skills for different times. And as we've gone into this period, which has become very stressful, there are certain leadership traits and individuals that have really flourished and been the backbone of teams and our business. That doesn't mean that other leaders aren't good leaders. This is a very, very unique time. And I think that strong leadership emerges, and we all look for leadership and follow great leadership. And so I think if you have a cultural value set that allows that to come forward, it can be pretty empowering to allow the organization to shift to what it needs at the moment. And this is a pretty unique time.
So many organizations are very hierarchical. And so sometimes you have leaders that in the younger demographics that are not necessarily allowed to rise. How can we make that happen?
Our experience is pretty flat. So I think everyone has full access to the entire executive leadership team in our org. So I think that maybe our perspective would be it's been pretty organic.
Joanne?
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about it is, in leadership studies, we make a distinction between positional leadership and leadership. And those aren't always the same, which is part of what your question actually says, that sometimes these people can emerge. And I think the best thing you can do is to allow that to emerge so that you're not stuck in your hierarchies, because sometimes people at the top completely are not good at this period of time. So other people can actually help them. And knowing how to work with those people only makes you look good if you're not great at doing it,
But you can't just do that when there's a crisis. You have to do that all the time.
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to ask if we could see what the poll results are saying. So that's interesting. So just doing what we overwhelmingly have said, making choices, balancing economics and style and human priorities. That's interesting. Does that surprise anybody?
No.
No.
I'd like to know who the one is that.
So how do you prevent a knee-jerk reaction? I mean, with variables changing in every day, with a market that's very short-term oriented, how do leaders park that and continue to do what's right for the company as opposed to reacting to all the other noise and valid signals that they have that are impacting their businesses? Profit or non-profit, doesn't matter.
Don't panic, no matter what. Never panic. Just stay calm, keep talking, keep meeting with your people, keep talking to your customers, and don't panic, because companies have been through worse than this. They've been through wars and pestilence and everything else. And the trick is to stay calm. This will pass.
How about a comment on the importance of empathy in ethical leadership? Joanne?
Well, I mean, empathy is extremely important, and it's part of caring. And I noticed there was also a question about care that I think is related to it. It's interesting to note that the word care comes from the Latin root cura, which is the same root as cure. And so when we think about caring in a crisis, or we think about empathy, you're not just feeling what other people are feeling, but you're trying in some sense to cure them of fear, of anxiety, and the things that can make them dysfunctional in society and in an organization.
George, Marcos?
Well, I think empathy is critical. And the problem is, if you have people, take a young woman who's got a family at home and maybe her husband's been laid off, you have to understand the emotion that she's going through. Or a young man who's got a brand new baby at home and loses his job, or is worried about losing his job. And so people don't make the same decisions they would make as when things are rolling along and everything's good, and you have to understand that. And taking time out just to walk down and have coffee with someone or say, how are things going? it means the world to people to know that somebody else in the organization is actually concerned about how they're feeling. This is a time that you cannot be cold. You have to be strong, but you have to be warm.
Yeah, one of the core values we had in our business is actually calls empathy out on its own, and we've got to be living through one of the most stark times of being empathetic and living in somebody else's shoes and trying to understand. I mean, look at the social unrest. I think it's a time right now for leaders and beyond that, just to really put ourselves in other people's shoes across all of the different challenges we're facing right now, which isn't just COVID. I think we found empathy to be something that we try to explicitly tell our teams to have, and we are living through a period where I think we can't have enough of that. I mean, we're having listening sessions and just having people come out and share what it's been like to be raised in a society where you're worried about your teenage boy going out because he isn't of the right color, or what's happening on the streets. And it's just, I think empathy right now, there's no line between work and personal, and there's a incredible opportunity for us to really promote this as leaders, not only in the community, but also at work and beyond, for sure.
Well, that's a great note to end this segment on. Thank you, Marcos. Thank you, Joanne. And thank you, George, for being part of this. I'm going to move on to the next segment in our discussion, which is ethical leadership in recovery.
Please welcome Sandeep Lally, President and CEO of the Calgary Chamber.
The agile, empathetic, and entrepreneurial response Calgary's business community demonstrated through the COVID-19 pandemic is exactly why we do what we do at the Calgary Chamber. COVID-19 has fundamentally shifted the way we live, work, and do business. In many cases, the pandemic eroded customer bases, threatened supply chains, or broke business models entirely. This is a huge challenge for business leaders working to navigate through to a new reality, since it's clear we will not be going back. But with every challenge, there is opportunity. The grit, resiliency, and determination of Calgary businesses is exactly what is needed to make the most of this opportunity. In doing so, though, it is imperative that we remember we can only emerge stronger together if we take care of one another. COVID-19 is a mental health pandemic as much as it is a physical health one. Its impacts will be felt even after we have treatment or a vaccine. As we recover, we must ensure that no one is suffering in silence, that everyone feels supported, and that there is ease of access to critical mental health resources. Staying connected and practicing empathy can save a life and will allow us to become more resilient as a community. In the recovery panel, we have Alan Norris. Alan is a community leader and the chairman and CEO of Brookfield Residential, a global mixed-use real estate builder and developer. Alan has a long list of awards and recognitions, including being the 2013 recipient of the Distinguished Business Leader Award.
Also joining us is Alison Sunstrum. Alison is founder and CEO of ConserveX, a Canadian company researching and applying blockchain technology in agriculture. She is also a community leader engaged in national dialogue on food security, an associate with the Creative Destruction Lab Rockies, and a leading authority on agritech.
I would also like to welcome David Dick to the panel. David is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Calgary and a fellow of the Canadian Centre for Advanced Leadership in Business. He oversees the Integrity Network and is an award-winning researcher and educator teaching the philosophy of money and business ethics. My question to the panel is, how will ethical leadership shape our recovery?
And David, that question goes to you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be in such great company. So ethics and business ethics generally thinks about recovery quite a lot, because you see in the business ethics literature discussions of recoveries from all kinds of crises, like the Enron crisis or the housing crisis meltdown. And one mistake that sometimes we can make in thinking about recovery is to just be sort of myopically focused on the very thing responsible for this immediate crisis. So sometimes in the wake of the Enron scandal, what you saw were people saying, oh, Enron was really, really bad. How do we avoid that in the future? I know, let's forbid mark-to-market accounting. And if we just have this one rule fixing this one problem, we will be perfectly fine going forward. As we recover, because the pandemic is so vivid in our mind, you might think that what you need to do is just stockpile masks, get a lot of hand sanitizer, and then we'll be fine in the future, but that's not the way to go about this. Instead, what we need to do is build a more kind of general resilience and flexibility that will allow us to deal with whatever crisis is coming up in the future. So what we're seeing is the businesses that were able to sort of survive and thrive the best are the ones who already had lots of flexibility built into their systems, or that were able to sort of innovate to it very quickly. So we have all kinds of flexibility now in what kind of hours people can work, what kind of flexibility they can have in their work schedule, and how people understand what their business model is. And it's that kind of resilience and flexibility that is what you need as an ethical matter to deal with whatever the next crisis will be, not just focusing on the specific threat that we're dealing with right now. We can't go back to the world the way it was, and I don't think we should want to go back, because the very kind of resilience and flexibility we need to develop and cultivate will allow us to refashion the world so that it's better, right? The kind of flexibility that we are putting into our workplaces now will allow us to be less sexist and less ableist and open the workforce to more people who maybe it wasn't available to before. We're seeing that the pandemic has disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That's a problem we need to fix with kindness, with flexibility, and resilience, which are sort of general virtues that we should focus on in recovery.
Thanks, David. I'd like to just remind people to continue to ask their questions, and we will have another poll that will show up later on in this segment. But I'd now like to turn to Alan. Some experts say that job one is to generate cash flow, to look for low-hanging fruit, to generate resources to buy the space that you need to consider having other strategic goals. Would you agree that that's where you have to focus in a recovery, where you can deploy your capital to take advantage of certain situations? Is that consistent with the principles of ethical leadership, or is it time to take a balanced approach and invest in new ways of doing things? Alan, your thoughts?
Thanks, Deborah. Also, it's an honor to be on the panel today as well. I think in this particular crisis, job one is safety. Obviously, we've been an essential service through this whole process, just picking us as an example. So the first thing was obviously to deal with enhanced safety protocols for our whole team. I mean, many could work remotely, but we also were working all our way through, particularly in our company, all across North America, dealing with existing projects and construction. But going back on the cash flow question, what I'd like to say is, I think starting at the crisis stage, I think it's imperative every company, when a crisis emerges, is to truly understand what cash flow scenario does work out, so that you can then determine clearly from that as to how you can approach things once you get to the recovery stage of the crisis. So whether you hunker down, whether you're looking to new innovations, new opportunities, and the thing which was touched on by the first panel as well is, at all times during this, whether it be the crisis period or the recovery period, you have to constantly communicate with all your team members. So, we've been going through this. We've been doing town halls every 2 weeks. We've been, sending things out every week. The key thing is to communicate the broad strategy as to what you're following through from a company point of view. But more than anything, going back on George's point on the first panel, is show that, things are okay. We're going to get through this, and explain exactly what initiatives we're going to undertake, why we're doing it, what's going on, rewarding our team members for those who are out there on the front lines dealing with some of the customer issues, all of the things, while many are working from home and some are working on job sites, and how we've enhanced safety in all respects. Also, what is going on in the business during that particular period of time. A little bit different than David, I think it's critical to understand what causes a crisis and try and make sure you are spending time during the recovery stage to understand what is going to be different when we come out the other side, and what steps we have to take to try and deal with what we think the new reality is. I mean, I think I look at this, and the advancement of technology initiatives, which we were undertaking and many others were doing prior to this crisis, have just been advanced significantly during this period of time. But try and find what it is required to emerge on the other side and be a leader in your particular field or industry.
Thanks, Alan. I'd now like to ask Alison, how can businesses be nimble to drive towards economic stability while facing the ongoing threat of a second wave, which we're starting to hear about happening in China? How do business leaders manage with a lack of resources, whether it's health, whether it's tests or equipment, or the ability to really support their workers in other environments?
Thank you, Deborah. What an awesome question, and what a privilege to be here today. Nimble is really the superpower of every successful startup. Startups live or die based on the ability to innovate, the presence or absence of good leadership, employee commitment, and the sheer chutzpah to reinvent ourselves when plan A doesn't come together. Our supply chains have been disrupted. Our customers may have disappeared. As we reopen, all of our companies are now to some degree a startup. And so key startup actions are to define the critical resources and priorities and communicate those priorities well and often. Get agile on resource planning and budgets, and be ready for constant change. Make your decisions based on your corporate financial reality at the speed of that change. And if you're not at the edge of technological advancement, get there. And I think, like was said by many of the panelists, listen to your employees, be empathetic. Many of our staff have experienced loss in many forms. And restructuring, particularly in an SME, can be a company culture killer, if not a company killer. Before a vaccine, our priority must be that we keep our employees safe, make their physical and mental health of the entire team job one. And that was said by many people already. I truly believe that strong, innovative companies with empathy, ethics, equality, diversity, and inclusion at their core will be key to our economic recovery. Thanks.
Thanks, Alison. I'm going to ask for our next poll to show up on the screen. During the recovery period, should the ethical leader pursue a return to normal, use both the old normal and new normal as learnings, or a bold leap to new ways of doing things? I'll be interested to see how everybody responds to that question. In the meantime, there's a balance that has to be struck between safety and the economy. How do ethical leaders balance these priorities? And I guess the other question is, what other characteristics do we need to see in addition to the empathy that we see in our leaders in these times? David.
Sure. I mean, the two of them go hand in hand, the safety and economy, right? You can't just opt for one or the other, because if there's maximal unsafetiness, then we're all dead and there is no economy. So you have to do both of those at the same time. How to strike the right balance is, of course, going to depend on what kind of industry you're involved in, right? The kind of work I can do, the kind of work I do largely can be carried out, albeit not perfectly, from my basement where I am right now. There's lots of other important essential work where you have to have other sorts of safety protocols because it has to be done in person. So the balance between safety and economy is going to depend importantly on which sector you are in. But I think the most important thing we're going to see, in addition to empathy, is simply kindness, right? If empathy is understanding how other people are feeling, kindness involves a kind of motivation to help them out, right? Empathy, I mean, Adam Smith called it something different, but he thought the entire capitalist economy was built on an understanding of other people's minds and what was going on with them. Now, you can take that understanding and use it to exploit them, but if you have cultivated the proper value of kindness, then you can use that understanding to help supply them what they need, because sometimes people don't even understand what it is they need, or they're afraid to ask. But if you are an empathetic and fundamentally kind leader, you can help your people out in ways they might not even think to ask for.
And that's what Dr. Bonnie Henry has been saying, be kind. We've heard her say that every day since the beginning of March. Anybody else like to weigh in on that question, Alison? Or
yeah, Deborah, I'll just chime in a little bit. I mean, going back, I think safety is paramount. I mean, for team members, for customer stakeholders. I mean, we know in this business, as David was touching on, I mean, as I said, when we're essential, we're out there trying to deal with customers who are very afraid and with their team members. And so you have to deal with those protocols, knowing that it is going to take longer to do the things that you used to do prior to that. And secondly, knowing that many customers, their circumstances, economics have changed significantly, perhaps since they entered into a contract with you. So you have to have the empathy not only with your team members, but also with customers, and realize that you're going to deal with them in a very fair fashion with respect to their economic circumstances. So that, and that over time, I mean, you deal with people properly. It's the same old adage with respect to you want to be treated the same way you'd be treated yourself. So deal with the customers on an empathetic way as well, understanding they're going through significant stress depending on their own personal situation.
Before I ask Alison to weigh in on this question, I'm going to ask for the poll results to be displayed. Okay, so we've got 55% of respondents saying both using both old normal and new learning as a foundation to build greater resiliency, followed by a bold leap to new ways of doing things, and finally return to normal. So does that surprise anybody?
It definitely doesn't surprise me.
No.
I think that we need to be innovative in our approach. And coming from agriculture, it's an industry that's constantly under attack. Drought, disease, you name it. And you tend, I'd say our ranchers and farmers have the resiliency built within them to respond to some of the things that are occurring today. But no, it doesn't surprise me. And I would have liked to have seen more being a bit bolder.
Right, that's what surprised me as well. Just one question, how do you balance empathy and kindness when you've had to lay off staff?
That's a very tough question, Deborah, because you're leaving behind your employees through a restructuring are always challenged. And it comes back to empathy, kindness, as David said, but the communication and being fair and understanding how you can help your employees as they exit the company. So it's a tough one for every leader, I think.
I'll chime in as well, Deborah. I mean, I think we made it clear to our whole team that when we're in the crisis period and when we are in the recovery period, we're going to stay true to everybody through the process. And we've actually, because to me, we didn't want to add to the problem, shall we say. And candidly, we were still out there dealing with all of the existing situation that we had before. It was just taking us longer to do things. What we've actually also done, and this was an initiative from our people and culture folks, is we've actually been helping all our employees and helping their family members, many of them who have been laid off or whatever, to try and give counseling and support from a career perspective. So using some of the, I'm not saying extra time, but they're doing it on their own time to try and support some family members of our employees through these tough times.
Well, that we've reached the end of this segment. So I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing your thoughts with us. And we're now going to move into the third segment of today's discussion, where we will discuss ethical leadership in transformation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eva Friesen, President and CEO of Calgary Foundation.
Good afternoon. At Calgary Foundation, we listened to charities and stepped up early in the COVID-19 pandemic to bridge the gap and meet their critical needs. Their stress points are access to technology to work remotely and deliver services virtually, increased demand for services such as mental health and family violence because of the crisis, and increased costs to serve their clients due to new physical distancing and PPE requirements. Not all charitable organizations will survive this crisis. Although still generous, the capacity for generosity is severely diminished given the devastating impacts to the economy. Without the same support from donations and sponsorships, the charitable sector faces a challenging future. A crisis often reveals the cracks in our systems, our societies, and our relationship. Cracks we've seen may be in our system of elder care and the lack of equity for marginalized people. Although we are all in the same COVID storm, we are in different boats. The struggle is not the same for all. A crisis also shines a light on the good in our society: generosity, compassion, and creativity. We have the opportunity and responsibility to squeeze every bit of learning from this crisis and allow it to transform our future. We owe it to ourselves to come out of this a better community, one where everyone belongs. Today's final panel conversation looks at transformation after a crisis, and I'm pleased to introduce Mac Van Wielingen. Mac is the founder and former CEO of ARC Financial and ARC Resources. He has become Canada's most sought-after thought leader and a passionate advocate for effective ethical leadership, corporate governance, and a shared national energy policy. Mac has a long list of awards and recognitions, including being the 2014 recipient of the Distinguished Business Leader Award. Also joining us is Don Farrell. Don is President and CEO of TransAlta Corporation and the 2019 recipient of the Management Alumni Excellence Award for the Haskayne School of Business. Robert Thirsk is also here today. Bob is one of Canada's most celebrated citizens, including having a high school named after him. Bob has spent more than a half year in space on a variety of international space missions and is interested to share his insights on preparing for crisis, an important component of the next normal. My question to the panel is, when is the right time to start thinking about transformation?
And Dawn, I'd like you to kick us off with an answer to that question. Dawn, you're muted.
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you're fine now.
The right time is to think about it after you get unmuted. No, I mean, I think in business and particularly in the energy industry, we've been under transformation for a long time. So this is just another transformation. And I think you've got to be thinking about it. The one thing I, thought about since I've been thinking about this is it's not just that you're thinking about transformation all the time, but from what place are you thinking about it? And at TransAlta here, what we're trying to do is think about our transformation from a place of confidence and knowledge about how to handle the pandemic and how to handle the virus, as opposed to fear. So as we think about our employees, as we think about where they're at, as we think about where we're going in our broader business strategy, we are really endeavoring to make sure that our transformation is from a place of confidence and not a place of fear.
Just to add, I wanted to bring in a comment that was made in a previous panel that we're all startups now. Is that
yeah.
I thought that was helpful.
I love that comment because that's what it feels like. We are all startups, and people commented about agility and what you have to look like. And you really do have to be agile because you get different information constantly about where I'm done with the words new normal. There is no such thing as normal. There's no such thing as a new normal. There's just what is, right? And so as I think that's a very insightful comment. I agree with that.
Yeah. I'd like to now turn to another question that as a business leader, I'm going to direct this to Mac. You have a responsibility to prepare for the next crisis, but also responsibility for shareholder returns, investment in new technologies, and business growth. How do you balance the competing interests of saving for the next crisis versus spending to drive growth that your shareholders expect and market?
Well, I think there's an enormous amount of tension that is different than what existed before. There's always tension around competing interests. In this environment with reduced resources and under financial constraints, there's going to be even more tension. And that truly is a leadership process, a leadership function, to be able to understand what is most important, where materiality rests, to think about what is most important, and to embrace it all comprehensively. And so it is in a sense a critical leadership challenge that's always present, but we're going to feel it with a lot more intensity as we move forward, because we're all having to operate within more financial and resource constraint.
So I'd like to remind everybody to keep asking your questions. They'll be screened and put forward to myself, and we will have a poll that will show up shortly. But now I'd like to ask Bob. Bob comes from a world where, as they said, and failure is not an option. So how do we think about preparing for the next crisis? I'm sorry.
Thanks, Deborah. The next global crisis could occur at any moment. It might be another pandemic, but it also could be something else. It could be a hurricane, it could be a nuclear reactor meltdown, and it could be an act of terrorism. But whatever the next crisis is, our responses need to be fast, they need to be effective, they need to be consistent. And as an astronaut, I sometimes wonder whether or not there are approaches from my business, from the space business, that could be adopted by terrestrial organizations to address crises. So for example, to perform well in space, astronauts repeatedly simulate space contingencies while we're on the ground. And the purpose of these realistic simulations is to expose flaws in our mission plan. And we practice this over and over again prior to launch to learn how we can best coordinate amongst ourselves. And as you said a minute ago, avoid knee-jerk reactions, which can be dangerous. So the job of an astronaut, in essence, is to prepare for failure, a broad spectrum of failures. Over the last 3 months, I've sometimes wondered if institutions had run complete and robust simulations of the pandemic prior to the outbreak, if we could have avoided some of the COVID-19 problems, like the staffing problems and the supply chain problems and the infection rate in the long-term care homes. Because when simulations expose the flaws in your plans, then you can take preemptive action and you can put in mitigation steps to be proactive. So no one, like you said, knows what the next contingency, what the next crisis is going to be, but I do recommend that organizations think about simulating the crisis, think about simulating their reaction, whatever the next crisis is. It'll help to develop an operational mindset and help to be very effective and fast and consistent when it does happen.
So when you say simulating potential situations, you're really saying we have to prepare for failure.
Yeah, so that's the definition of what I do. I spend 0 days on the ground preparing for normal days in space. I spend thousands of hours on the ground preparing for fires, for depressurizations, for medical emergencies. Because if you can take care of those, you can take care of a normal day in space.
Right. I'd like to ask for the poll to come up so we can have, this is our last one for this session, about as we consider transformation beyond a vaccine, what would be the best outcome? As everybody answers the question, how do we come out of this in a world we want rather than just recovering to how things have been in the past? And how does leadership fit into that, especially given that leaders are going to have to lead differently as we are working in environments that are now going to be more dispersed, as we've understood that it is something that we can see as like the workplace can be decentralized. So you need a different kind of leader as well as moving forward. And do we come out of this in a way that has left the past behind, or are we just trying to recapture it? I'm curious. Any one of you can answer that question. Dawn, Mac, Robert, Bob?
Yeah, these are really tough questions because we're used to, as leaders, thinking we can see the future and then we aim our strategies at what we think the future is. And really, I've been working for 35 years, and for the first time, I'm super flummoxed. I finally have to give over and say, okay, I've never really known what the future was, and I have to admit it now, right? But I kind of go back when I think about our organization. We were very quickly running down a road of letting fear drive our transformation, as opposed to really thinking about the future we wanted. So For example, for us, we're an essential service. Half our people have been working since the beginning under very, very good protocols. No one's gotten COVID, and we thought about every way that we could to keep people safe, because if they don't go to the power plants, imagine a pandemic and no power. There's nothing worse than that, right? But as we started to think about what do we do next, our people in the office all wanted to stay home, and they were staying home out of fear of COVID, not because that was the right business model or the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. So we decided to bring everybody back over the summer, because we have the space, we can put the protocols in place. And then as we go, we now have a team working on, to Bob's point, what does it look like if kids can't go back to school in the fall and there is a second wave and there is another lockdown? Do we really want to go back to our homes? And the answer is actually a bunch of us really don't have to. Some of us will, because it's the right thing to do. And we've really had to think a lot about people. We talk about empathy. This is a whole person crisis. The fact that you're at home doesn't necessarily make you safe. For some of our employees, it's brought on all sorts of anxiety and mental illness. They're not touching people or seeing people. We've brought some of those people back to the office now, and they are far better off. So we're really thinking about, okay, we're here. Over the summer, we're going to learn more. Over the fall, we're going to learn more. But how do we actually create our culture that can take our company into the future, be strong, be confident, and have a culture that works in whatever this world is that we're living in now?
Mac?
Yeah, when Dawn said we don't really know what the future looks like, I totally agree with that. But I would add, we don't know what the future looks like, and it's very humbling, but we can know what our current reality looks like. Yeah. And as we make decisions going forward as leaders, it's not a foregone conclusion that we even understand current reality. And I think that is a challenge, and it's confronting of all of us. And I'm going to give you an example. I work in finance, and I have a background in economics, so this isn't going to surprise anybody. But I'm very surprised that there isn't more discussion about the massive debt load that we've taken on in our country. And if you look at it at the household level, it's shocking. And our household financial risk parameters are at record high levels, and they were going into the pandemic. And if you look at the corporate sector, it's a similar story. Debt levels are some among the highest in the world, our corporate sector, and then most of our provinces, and now the national government. And if you add all those numbers up, which I went and did, because that's the kind of stuff I do, it totaled to be $7 trillion across all of those jurisdictions and those entities in our society, which is 350% of our GDP. Now, those are statistics. We will feel that, all of us, in our lives as we go forward. And it's one of the reasons why there's no question that we're not going back, in a sense, to the way we were, because we're having to carry the burden of those liabilities.
Thanks, Mac. Now I'd like to just see what the poll results are, if we could have those on the screen. So the majority of respondents say the entrepreneurial spirit, which may lead to more adoption of technology and changing social systems, possibly a universal basic income, would be the best outcome. That's interesting. Do those results surprise any of you?
No, I wasn't able to vote on that last poll, but I tried to. I would have chosen the third option there. You know, while waiting for the next crisis, no matter what it is, I think we can prepare for it by, you know, as Max said a minute ago, address the financial liquidity, which is a bit of a problem, but also the social inequalities as well. You know, COVID-19 really showed us the gaps, the shortcomings in our response to the marginalized people. And I think if we address, you know, some of the inequalities in our society, like poverty, discrimination, the mental health divide, I think we will be better prepared for the next crisis, which is why I tried to click on the third option there.
Thanks, Bob. And I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this segment of our program today. I'm now going to bring back our three partners from the Haskayne School of Business, the Calgary Chamber, and the Calgary Foundation to join us again. This summit was put on because all three organizations are devoted to meaningful, bold, and innovative community engagement and have taken significant steps to help in this unprecedented time. At Haskayne, we're moving ahead to undergo research projects that look at the impact of COVID-19 on business. The school will also partner with Calgary Economic Development and the Calgary Chamber to match students with organizations needing help over the summer. The Chamber launched #HereForYYC to advocate on behalf of Calgary businesses, do webinars to connect business owners in these uncertain times, and is gathering resources to allow business to open up safely. The Calgary Foundation launched the Pandemic Recovery Program and redirected $3 million to charities in Calgary and Treaty 7 First Nations communities. In phase 1, the relief phase, they are supporting the immediate needs of charities. In phase 2, they'll be focusing on activating strategies to get them back to pre-pandemic levels. And in the third phase, resilience will support strategies and technologies for strengthening organizations for their operational futures. So to the three representatives of the partner organizations that are now on our screen, what was your biggest takeaway from today and what has inspired you to do next? I'm going to start with Jim DeWald.
Well, thanks, Deborah. And let me start first by thanking you so much for your leadership throughout these times and your great job today. And also on behalf of all three of us, we're very grateful for all the panelists. I think I've certainly enjoyed this hour and I hope others have. In terms of takeaways, I don't think it's possible to have one, but there are a few things that really struck me. One is sort of the comparisons, or Mac had talked about tensions between initially hope and despair. And, George had talked about the need for empathy, and he was very compelling in his discussion of, maybe a young person who has a child at home, lost job. We have to be so caring as leaders about those situations, but also a great discussion about hope and how, we have to keep our eye on the future. We have to communicate with people. But I also was quite struck with, from a pure business standpoint, Alison spoke of, actually, I'm going to steal this phrase, nimble is a superpower. That was really powerful, as well as that we're all startups. But on the other side of the ledger, Mac talking about 7 trillion in debt and the rigidity and the lack of flexibility that gives organizations and individuals, then I leave on sort of a down note, like how we're going to get through this. So I'm just in a state where I have a lot more to think about.
I think we all do. Sandeep, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you to yourself for moderating as well. And this has been a bit of a journey. And I think for me, I've been taking some notes here, and because I knew I was going second, I had the pleasure of putting it down and not echoing Jim. But I would say, overall, I think above board leadership is what's required to lead through this, anchored in ethical leadership of kindness and empathy. But 3 key things stood out to me, and one of them is that there's fierce capitalism is required, and having the humanity through your own actions for community, which leads to the second one, to say inclusive communities that move past the veneer. We all talked about and listened to examples of how we need to move past and spend maybe 90% of our time listening and really follow up with humanity being in our actions. And finally, free markets require free politics. So for that, it means to have, policy has to take precedence over politics, even more so now than before, in the sense that it's inspired me to continue to work to have civil society as part of a policy development so that we can have inclusive voices and put democracy back in the hands of our citizens in between election cycles. Because as we heard, this is one crisis, more crises will come, and nobody is set up for that. So how do you continue to listen to civil society to move forward?
Thanks, Sandy. Eva, you get the last word.
Oh, it's a bad place to be is last, because it's all been said. But I will say, I noticed a theme through all three panels was to talk about compassion and caring and taking that approach to the leader. And that, you know, is very, very important and goes back to we're all in the same storm, but in different boats. Our experiences are very different, and listening to learn about the other experience is very key. And I love the statement, nimble is the new superpower. And I'm inspired to figure out how we can flex our nimble muscles, become more agile as leaders. I think that's critical.
Thank you so much, Eva. Thanks to everyone who participated today. This has been a very interesting and information-packed hour for all of us, I'm sure. And one of the things as a journalist as well, this comment that kept coming out about the importance of communicating and being transparent is really something, you know, journalists have been very committed to. And of course, to hear that really resonating as loudly as I did in this last hour is also, it's encouraging to hear, because that wasn't always the case. So that was probably my top takeaway, as well as Alison's, nimble being the superpower, and we're all startups in some form. So I'd like to thank everybody again for being with us today, and thank again the panelists who have joined us. And for everybody who was here, we hope to see you in person next year, June 17th, 2021, at our next Distinguished Business Leader Awards event that we very much hope will take place in person and not on a computer screen. Thanks so much. Think about what you've learned today, and we'll see you again.